Welcome to Pelagic Rising Conversations, episode 2 of a brief overview history of the history of conservation globally and in South Africa with Dr. Div de Villiers. We're continuing. Good morning, Dr. de Villiers.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, everyone.
So let us just give the readers a little bit of a condensed reminder of where we ended last time and what we were touching on last time, and then we can continue because I think we ended near the 1960s or the 1950s.
Yeah, we ended pretty much where the homelands of South Africa started, so we ended in around about 1970, but perhaps just for a reminder, globally we looked at the Industrial Revolution and the need for forests, the overuse of forests, and then that was really the start of what we called modern conservation because there was a need for resources. And then the modern conservation movement, but later than that, actually spearheaded by John Muir, who was a preservationist, a mountaineer, and what they sometimes call the father of national parks and wilderness areas. And then his counterpart a little bit later, a chap by the name of Gifford Pinchot, and I think I pronounced that incorrectly yesterday, but Gifford Pinchot had a important role to play with the conservation movement. So he was looking at conserving and using forests in the United States. We touched on the earliest national parks being Yellowstone and Yosemite in the United States. And then Aldo Leopold, probably one of the first ecologists, who came up with a land ethic essay and a very important book where he emphasized the importance of science and using science to manage our natural resources because he said that humans are part of nature. Then the 1970s animal rights movements, sort of pros and cons of the animal rights. We discussed things like the whales and saving the whales. We looked at the various summits, conservation summits that there have been, biodiversity summits in Rio in 1992. And then we moved on to the South African history of conservation. Very briefly touched on the first written decree, which was a 1654 decree banning the use of and killing of penguins. That was by Van Riebeck. And then later the forestry laws that came into play also in the Cape and around the Cape Colony. Then when the British arrived in South Africa and colonized South Africa, we had a number of colonial laws, again, forestry being prominent. But what we also discovered was that the Amaxhosa king, Sakhile, had already implemented some conservation measures to some of the forests of the Transkei in the Eastern Cape, what is now the Eastern Cape. So already there were some laws that were in place, although they weren't written laws. Then we looked at the history of game reserves and national parks in South Africa, the Kruger National Park being the first national park established in 1926, and that emulated by the British in Natal of the day where they established the Umfolozi Hluhluwe nature reserves, or national parks as they called them. And they expanded those in the 1930s through forced removals. So we touched on the forced removals of people and the implications thereof. And we looked at the establishment of various provincial nature conservation departments, like the Cape Nature Conservation Department of 1952, which was formed because of fisheries, inland fisheries management, species that are now considered exotic and alien and unwanted, like your trout. And then we moved on to the Bantustans of the 1970s, where the apartheid government created homelands, so-called homelands, for the various black tribes of South Africa, including here in our Eastern Cape area, the Ciskei, former Ciskei, and the former Transkei areas. So yeah, that's pretty much where we left it. And we touched on the forward-thinking ecologists Ken Tinley and Willem van Riet, who proposed models for the homeland areas, and they proposed that there must be, or there should be, community consultation before establishment of nature reserves or national parks, and that there should be an emphasis on communities benefiting from them, especially surrounding communities, and being involved in the joint management of those areas.
Before I forget, are you able to maybe list the nature reserves established back in the 1950s, 70s, and those that are they still existent? Aren't they? Where are these areas between former Ciskei and Transkei at the moment? So we've mentioned Mkombati, we've mentioned Dwesa Kwebe.
Yes. If you look at the former Transkei along the Wild Coast, right up in the north, some Mkombati was established, actually as a game reserve and for a hunting reserve. And that was in the 1970s. Dwesa Kwebe, further to the south, had already been a state forest, but was formally protected then as a nature reserve, and Hluleka Nature Reserve. And then you also got Silaka just outside Port St. John's. So very small reserves in comparison with the 300-kilometre long coastline. A very small percentage of the area of the former Transkei and of the Wild Coast was then actually protected, formal nature reserves. And then there are a couple of small reserves inland of the coast. Around Mthatha, there was Nduli and Luchaba. And then the Transkei government also proclaimed Nsikeni, which is the largest high-altitude wetland in South Africa, 9,000 hectares, and Ongeluk's Neck, next to the Lesotho border. And that is a mountainous catchment area of about 13,000 hectares. And I think that's pretty much if I remember off the top of my head now, the nature reserves of the former Transkei. So if we look at Ciskei, there the Lennox Sebe Nature Reserve was established, and Lennox Sebe was the leader of the Ciskei at the time. That was later expanded and incorporated into the Andrisvoslu Kudu Reserve for the former South African side, and became a 40-something thousand hectare Great Fish River Nature Reserve, which is a key area for black rhino conservation. The other area along the Ciskei was Mpofu, near Fort Beaufort, and a very important model, and there they pretty much used the Tinley Van Riet model, was Tsolwana. So the former white farms were bought out, and the Tsolwana Nature Reserve was created in Ciskei, with a model there being on sustainable hunting and generating income for the Parks Board as well as for local people around the Tsolwana area. And that was through mainly trophy hunters coming through particularly from America.
So let us continue down the history of conservation.
Right, so let's go to the Bantustans and just finish the conservation movement of those 1970s until the early 1990s, when there was an amalgamation between the former South Africa area and the homelands, and we became a new South Africa after the elections. So up until that time, there was a lot of work done to try and curb the soil erosion that was occurring. Remember, yesterday I mentioned that 13% of South Africa, only 13% of South Africa was set aside for the majority population of the country, meaning that 87% was for white farmers and 13% was now given for black farmers and black people to go and live on. Obviously, this created a problem of space. Remember, the AmaXhosa have a very much a cattle-centered culture, and there was just not enough space for all the cattle and agriculture that they were practicing. So obviously there was a lot of soil erosion, and particularly one thinks of the former Transkei area. So the government of the day came up with betterment schemes. That was the name that they actually gave it, a betterment scheme. So particularly after World War II in the 1940s, they started implementing fencing and allotment of plots, and insisting that the AmaXhosa use their systems, let's call it Western systems of agriculture. So I think there were definitely good intentions. If you read the literature, there were good intentions to, let's say, make people aware of the importance of soil conservation and water conservation and looking after your grasses, because a lot of those areas were grassland areas. But it was not in a consultative manner. It was forced upon the people, and there was a lot of resentment for the betterment schemes. Also, when the National Party government came into power in the 1940s, they used the betterment schemes for their political ideologies, and they used it to forcefully remove people from certain areas and put them in other areas. So it became like a political pawn, and people became pawns in the whole political game.
All in the name of conservation.
Unfortunately, all in the name of conservation. So conservation got a very bad rap and a very bad record. And when you talk about zoning of areas for conservation, even now today, 60 years on, or even more than 60 years, people still have that resentment to the term zone. And you know, even if you talk about conservation, particularly soil conservation or agricultural conservation, sometimes you'll find in community meetings that there's a lot of resentment to that and to that terminology. So you've got to steer away from those terms. And even the terms of nature reserve and national park have met with a lot of resistance in the recent past. And only now is it sort of starting to dawn on new generations that, you know, there are positive things to national parks, nature reserves, and definitely positive things to conservation. But you've got to look at the history of it and understand why there has been some resentment towards conservation.
Or perhaps not necessarily change the name, but maybe, you know, introduce it in a different method to, if one could maybe look at inclusive conservation, or rather than, you know, if something's become a bit of a swear word or has a bit of a tint to it, changing the name, I guess, doesn't always help, because if it's still done in the same manner, you know. You did mention in the previous podcast that today it is being done differently, and we can actively differently or persistently differently than back then. So maybe we can touch on that a bit later.
Yeah, I think let's move on to the sort of more modern day South Africa, but bearing in mind where conservation is coming from and a lot of the black people's perception of conservation. I mean, let's just look at the marine laws. I touched on that in the previous podcast, part of this podcast as well. Yeah. Was no explanations were given to people when suddenly marine laws were implemented. There was marine conservation and fisheries conservation taking place in the Western Cape with laws from the late 1800s, early 1900s to protect resources. Not 1800s, sorry, I'm wrong there. In the 1900s, certainly there were laws preventing and controlling fisheries. But those laws were not being implemented in the Eastern Cape, and especially not along the Wild Coast. So nobody even knew about those laws. There's little and no consultation about marine conservation. And then suddenly, like marine protected areas being established in the Dwesa area. Obviously, people would resent that they'd been using the resources for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And then suddenly there's this control and prevention of using your natural resources, which they relied on.
But also the practicality of declarations, and this isn't just South Africa. I know America's having problems with it as well, but I guess also if one, you know, this transcends over to rhinos as well, is, and I'll get around to that, but with these MPAs, you know, we get so excited when we hear another marine protected area has been declared and the wonderful one, save the ocean and everything's great. But an MPA should come with protection. It comes with enforcement. And if countries like America can't even keep up with their own MPAs, what is the use of declaring something if it comes with a signage, a board on a area in the parking lot? And also we're declaring, and also with the international pressure, the global pressure of percentages that need to be declared. So all these countries are racing now to declare. And I think I need to get the South African statistics of how many more MPAs have to be declared in the next 5 years. But what on earth is the point if we can't keep up with actually protecting it? I was at a stakeholder meeting last year where the practicality of an MPA comes forward so clearly, But usually when the government officials come to have these meetings, they're also not prepared for the issues they're going to face, which is, you can actually, you only see what something really is once it's functioning, once you're looking at the engine, once you understand how it works. So, for example, a lot of these co-op fisheries don't have GPSs on their boats. So when they're out at sea, they keep getting fined for fishing within the MPA, but there are no beacons out there. There are no indications where they are within the MPA, and they don't have the GPS on their boats. These are hard-working, struggling fishery co-ops. So one has to look at, when we go all gung-ho and we're going to protect everything left, right, and center, but if we don't have anything to back it up, one has to wonder what is the way. And again, without consultation or understanding the people that are using the area, what it would actually really mean to them. Because are you promising them your future generation, your kids will still be able to fish? Your children, your future generations. But what about right here, right now?
No, you're right. And those promises you're talking about, promises of jobs, promises of benefits and so forth, very often don't materialize. And that was exactly the case in the Dwesa scenario, because Chief Ndlombeni, who acknowledges that he was actually consulted at the time of the establishment of Dwesa as a nature reserve in 1975, says that the benefits and the promises made never materialized. People were denied access to the reserve, to the resources. They had to pay a R1 entrance fee. Now, R1 in the 1970s was worth something, but they didn't have a rand to pay to enter, and so they were restricted from going to the marine areas where they collected their shellfish. So after 1994, and that was when our new South Africa came about, local people decided that they were now owners of South Africa and of land, and they started invading some of the protected areas like Dwesa and Twebe to go and utilize their resources that they'd been utilizing for centuries. And they started stripping the rocks of mussels and shellfish. And there were various land claims and land invasions that took place during that time. So that was the dawn of the new South Africa, and it wasn't all fun and roses. But there were some very positive things that took place in those early years of democracy, and I'll touch on those now. So one of the things was looking at participatory forest management and community-based natural resource management, as well as joint management of the protected areas. All very good in theory, but you've mentioned just now that if you don't put some money into management and you don't create active management, the means to the active management, it becomes very difficult or impossible to implement it. And with continually reduced budgets for conservation, there's been a failure to implement both of those, PFM and community-based natural resource management. And there's been pretty much a return to the fences and fines model, which was the initial model that was used for conservation, not only in South Africa, but I think worldwide. So let's look at post-1994, some of the positives. There was the amalgamation of all these little homeland areas into new provinces. So the Ciskei and Transkei became part of the Eastern Cape. And I must say that amalgamation was actually quite a smooth transition in the Eastern Cape province. We also had expanded protected areas. So
where were you now? Were
at
you
that time,
already working?
I was already working.
Okay.
I'd been working from 1983. So around in the 1990s, I'd already had 10 years in conservation. A lot of my counterparts feared what was happening in South Africa and left to New Zealand and Australia and other areas. But I decided to stay on in South Africa and try and make conservation work. That's where my passion is. It's what I know. I know this coastline, I know the forest and so forth. So some of us stayed, and as I say, the transition to the former, including the Ciskei, the black people from Ciskei and the Amaxhosa from the Transkei, was a very smooth transition. I've written about it in the past. There was virtually no animosity, and we just gelled like one big family. So it was great. The early parts of the 1990s, going into the 2000s, there was a lot of positive stuff in the Eastern Cape relating to conservation. I mean, we had, obviously, we expanded a lot of protected areas. I mentioned the Great Fish River Nature Reserve as an example, but I mean, even national parks. Addo National Park expanded from a tiny little national park into this monstrous 200,000 odd hectare national park. Some great strides were made. Politicians of the time, you think of the Vali Musas, you think of Kada Asmal, you think of those politicians who were really passionate about the environment in those early years of our democracy. We worked the legislation. Obviously, legislation had to change, and some of the world's best environmental legislation came about, like your National Environmental Management Act and the various specific environmental management acts that are associated with that framework legislation. So you had the Integrated Coastal Management Act, you had the Biodiversity Act, you had the Protected Areas Act, all those things, Air Quality Act, things that were taken from some of the best legislation in the world, and we created fantastic legislation. But again, you can have all the greatest legislation in the world. If you haven't got people to implement it, then you've got a problem. And with budgets being cut continuously, we've got all this good legislation, but as the human resources, the human capital has been eroded, and there are less and less people to implement that, so we still struggle to ensure that our legislation is complied with. And that's one of the problems. But I'm touching on the positives, so let's look at that as a positive. Great legislation. Transfrontier projects. So transfrontier projects are, we actually had a term for it, peace parks. And that was linking other countries on our borders, and even within the borders of South Africa, countries like Lesotho. So Lesotho is a landlocked country within South Africa. And we had transfrontier projects to link their national parks or nature reserves with ours. And it was a beautiful term, peace parks. And so we've got some of the biggest protected areas on paper in the world. You know, you think of the Kalahari area, that's the old Kalahari, and linked with Botswana and Namibia, and you've got the Limpopo area, which is Kruger National Park, linked with parts of Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and a number of these transfrontier parks. Excellent concept, and some of them are working really well. And then you've also got the added benefit of the politics. And politics is key in conservation. Yes. We haven't even touched on that yet, but just about everything we've been talking about has been about politics. You know, at the end of the day, even I mentioned the betterment schemes, all the good intentions in the world, but politicians get involved and they use conservation for their benefits. So the Transfrontier Project is a positive movement that involves politics and cross international boundaries. And I mean, conservation doesn't worry about political boundaries. So that's one of the very good movements since we've been a democracy. Also, I think non-government organizations have become more and more involved and been accepted as a critical part of the conservation movement. When I first started in conservation in the 1980s, we used to look at these non-government organizations as a bunch of hippies, just like walking around in sandals and earrings in the ears. And we looked at them and thought, these are wannabe conservationists, wannabe game rangers, and they're not worth it. They're not actually, they don't understand what's going on. But more and more, as the years have progressed, those non-government organizations have become the driving force of conservation in South Africa. And without them, I can tell you now, conservation in South Africa would be in a bad place. So, organizations such as WESA, the Wildlife Environmental Society of South Africa, WWF, the EWT, the Endangered Wildlife Trust, just some of the big NGOs, and then a whole lot of small NGOs and non-profits cropping up as the years went by and really playing a meaningful role in conservation. Because as we progressed, less state spending, lots of talk about conservation, lots of talk about climate change in the last decade or so, everyone climbing on a bandwagon. But at the end of the day, talk's cheap. As my dad used to say, talk's cheap, money buys the whiskey. So we're not even doing the basics right anymore to conserve our natural resources in many cases. We talk about climate change, but really the basics is what's
which nobody really understands how to implement. I mean, we can preach about plastic as much as we like. You can't get away with not using plastic. You can't. So one forgets how to look deeper into how does one tackle something. Like you say, climate change, it's a whole lot of talk, and we can tell people not to use plastic and clean up the beach. You're going to use plastic. It's everywhere. So how does one stop the plastic, not the use of plastic? You know, if something's on the shelves, it's on the shelves. You don't have a choice. So in a lot of ways, you know, you speak of we and the basics, but it's not being explained. The avenues aren't being explained.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. As we've been saying, conservation is a very complex topic, and it's very easy to say I'm anti-plastic or I'm anti-hunting. Well, then come up with solutions. You know, we've got people that are super bright that can come up with these solutions. So there's certain things that we have to use, and it's a matter of trying to find ways of using them so that they have less impact on the environment than what they currently do. So to continue, I think, you know, climate change is real, in my opinion, obviously, and there's definitely a contribution towards it from mankind and the way that we are overusing our resources, burning of fossil fuels and so forth. I don't think there's any doubt about it, but we can only do what we can do. So yeah, in South Africa, for example, I continually preach to just do the basics. Conserve your forests. We've only got like 3% of our country that's natural forest. So look after that. Don't continually destroy it. We've got such a water scarce country. We're arid. Some people don't realize just that we're almost a desert. You know? So look after your freshwater resources. But we continually drain wetlands. We still continue. I mean, I read this morning that they want to put a road in Cape Town right through the wetlands at Noordhoek to connect some communities. I mean, they've been fighting for decades, since whenever I can remember, to conserve those endemic toads and frogs in that area. They've got little walkways under the existing road, you know, tunnels and people have frogging evenings when the frogs are breeding to go and take them across this one road. Now they want to put like a highway type thing, slap bang through these wetland areas. Yeah, come on, you know, we've got to
the thinking is astonishing. I mean, if you just think about that in a linear way, it's having stakeholder meetings to tell people more land's being declared and we're doing everything, and even those who can't afford it getting fined for just wanting to live off their own land, you know, because that's the way it should be working, is within management and you know, and then but let's just throw all of that out the window and build a highway, you know. Another
thing is South Africa, you mentioned earlier, you know, what the percentages of protected areas on our coastline. I think after the recent Pakisa operations and Pakisa initiative of our former President Jacob Zuma, a number of marine protected areas were established, but they haven't been funded. So as you say, we've definitely got more than 10% of our coastline now that's under marine protected areas, but how much of that is managed? Very little, I can tell you. One of our oldest marine protected areas is the Tsitsikamma one, and that's about 80 kilometers long. It's probably one of the oldest marine protected areas in the world. I think it was established in the 1960s, if I remember correctly, and that's well managed. But to just put a whole lot of paper parks down on a map for the purpose of reaching your percentage is not very productive. And what I'm getting at over here is our terrestrial area as well. We've got less than 10% in South Africa that's set aside as terrestrial nature reserves. And they were managed reasonably well until the recent past. But now with budget cuts and people being appointed in positions that they shouldn't be in, and I'm not going to get into that now, but there's a lot of token appointments that have been taking place to get demographics right and understand that whole, and it's a complete different debate. The fact of the matter is, if you've got protected areas, protect them, look after them, put the resources into those areas. And since 1994, a lot of these protected areas, bearing in mind, we only got, at that stage, I think, was 6% that was protected. A lot of those are being invaded by people land invaders. And a lot of those areas are from people that were not in those areas in the first place. So when we touch on Cape Town and wetlands, I think of the Drift Sands Nature Reserve, which was established in, I think, 1983, certainly in the early 80s. That has now been invaded during the COVID time period by thousands of people that were bussed into that area and put into an area of the Cape Flats that have endemic species and wetlands that are nowhere else. So land invasions have been a big problem in the recent past for a lot of our protected areas as well. And that's, now we're getting into some of the negative aspects. I've touched on positive aspects, but in the recent past, there's a lot of negative things happening in the South African environment. That is one of them. And, government's got to step in. There are laws and they have to be implemented.
I'd also just want to inject quite a bit. They touched on quite a lot. Very important points right now. And I just feel I really do need to inject that, yes, however, not just South Africa. These, like you say, paper parks and promises and percentages and saying yes and going off and declaring, it is in a lot of other countries as well. If I think about just coming back from the Philippines, what's going on there, also massive issues. And because of the location of the Philippines, I mean, it's the municipalities' divers that does the coast guarding when illegal fishing's going on. And those vessels are, I'm always scared to mention countries because there's a lot of hatred suddenly going around in the world towards certain countries and other countries, and it's always another country's fault and another people's fault. But they're dealing with some pretty hairy situations there as well. I mean, you're looking at a little dinghy of 6 municipality divers and a couple of volunteers like myself in one of the dive centers I was working with going out at 3 a.m. in the morning, armed, sure, but you approach that vessel, it's 20 times the size of this little SUV, and very angry fishermen, and that's a very dark industry as well. There's we call it marine slavery now. You're dealing with some very angry people on that boat as well. So not only just in South Africa, and touching on land invasions or people moving into certain areas, again, is the argument with the individual, the collective individual, is the argument with the economic department, again, where, yes, humans are part of nature and we are part, and conservation involves everything. As we touched, it will always be political. It will always be economical. Those human elements, and so, yes, we're looking at land invasions, but we're approaching a time where, I guess this is another podcast, where do they go? And because it's never been explained to them, honestly, the way they see it, it's a massive park. And a lot of these parks are expensive. If you're going to stay in those lodges, in those parks, you are going to pull a certain demographic. So, okay, we can't fish anymore. We can't hunt anymore. I can't have cattle anymore to roam freely. We can't do this. We can't do that. Going back a few generations, we were removed. Okay, you are referring that they aren't originally from certain areas, but they were removed somewhere along the line from somewhere where they were just fine. And we're reaching a very tense period. And we can probably say humans are part of nature as much as we like, and that is a fact or truth, because there is a difference between the two. But how do you sometimes tell a family that soil erosion is more important than their livelihood? And, it gets incredibly, conservation's in the dawn of it, very, very difficult discussions because, I guess, of how it was dealt with in the past, Yeah,
no, you're right. It's, and the whole thing of land and land occupation and invasions, and that is a completely different subject which can make, 2 or 3 podcasts easily.
A non-profit on its own, really.
Yeah, for sure. Many.
Many.
Many. But let's just look at the toad that I spoke about earlier on in Noordhoek. So there's a little informal settlement. It's got quite big now in that vicinity, and this road is going to be of benefit for people in that informal settlement, because not only is it going to relieve traffic congestion in the mornings, but it's also going to make accessibility to those people and shops and what have you. It's going to improve that accessibility. So Now you've got to explain to people, and this is your point, I think, you've got to explain to people that, listen, we can't put this road here because there are endangered frogs and toads in these wetlands, and that's very important for biodiversity. People are going to say, but hey, you're not putting frogs and toads ahead of our welfare and our well-being, where, you can just imagine the arguments that are going to come about something like that. And I'm just using that as one example. There are hundreds, thousands of similar examples. But what I'm saying is, if we as South Africa realize that wetlands are important, biodiversity is critical, some of our protected areas have been put in the most important biodiverse rich areas, then I'm saying we've got to protect those and make people aware of those, of the importance of those areas, and protect them at all costs. That's my feeling about it. You've got such a small percentage of the country that's set aside for conservation. Come on, let's look after it. And in future, when we look at expanding protected areas and creating new ones, that's where we've got to make sure that we're selecting the correct areas, and we're not just selecting an area around a dam or just an area that's an open space or whatever the case may be, for the sake of putting a percentage out there. We're looking at an area that really needs conservation, that's going to be of benefit to us and to future generations and is rich in species. And then we proclaim that area, then we protect that area, and we get people to buy into protecting it, and at all costs we look after it.
I agree with what you're saying. I think I would add, you listed that human, livelihoods are also critical and important. And utilization of resources will absolutely never disappear. We're not just one day going to wake up and not need to eat and fish and build and live and make, if we look at the indigenous, make our medicines, and then we think that, and when I say we, I'm speaking of a certain demographic, frowns upon the use of, well then, tell the local tribes or indigenous peoples that they can't use the medicinal plants anymore. Okay, well then you stop buying your 3,000 Rand moisturizer that's got shark oil in it. It becomes incredibly hypocritical. And the one is so sincere and organic and rooted into heritage, and the other one is so into probably comfort, luxury, ease, and vanity. These are medicinal plants we are speaking of. And all these products we do use have resources in them. It might not come from our country, which probably makes it even worse. So I think, definitely in the blog where I'm going to put down after this, I'd like to list these things, but I think you do need a fighter that fights for the environment alone, that can't be swayed. But are we really still there where some are going to fight for the people and the people only, and some are going to fight for the land and the land only? It needs to be under the same umbrella. Humans are not going to go away. Utilization is not going to go away, but resources can. The land can.
Yeah, and I think your point about livelihoods and the importance of livelihoods is a critical one. And let's jump back to our areas and the Eastern Cape, and we look at the Dwesa example again, where people were denied access to the livelihoods that they'd been depended upon for forever. So, we've got to take that into consideration when you proclaim a protected area, to allow people still to benefit from it and ensure that their livelihoods aren't impacted upon in a negative way. Or if they are, then there's an alternative. So they were supposed to get jobs, they were supposed to get work through the tourists coming in and so forth. That's what we've got. Well, tourism and tourists is another topic.
I don't think I should be hosting that podcast.
But I know we're coming towards the end of our time, and I just want to touch on organized crime. So you've got the environmental crime, let's call it environmental offenses by people that may be accessing areas that they shouldn't be so that they can do subsistence hunting or collect fish for their families. It's still against the law. But then there's a complete different type of crime, and that's where this environmental crime of greed, and that reared its ugly head in South Africa in the last couple of decades. So organized crime syndicates have been established, and we just think immediately of the rhino situation since 2007, where rhinos have been poached to a point that they were on a downward curve and we're heading towards extinction. You know, let's be honest. If we didn't pump the amount of money and resources into curbing rhino poaching, that would be a very different scenario to what we have today, where we still have a few thousand rhino walking around in protected areas and on game farms. But these organized crime syndicates are extremely well organized and well resourced.
May I ask, are a lot of these syndicate leaders nationals or foreigners?
It's both. So depending also on what the product is that they're after, that's also dependent on which country they're from. We know that the rhino syndicates are headed up pretty much by the various Asian people from Vietnam, Laos, China, Hong Kong. But then there are other things that get traded, especially now with the internet. So plants are huge. Cycads for many years have been traded, and there the syndicate leaders are South Africans, and cycads go to Gauteng in the northern parts of South Africa as features for people that want to show this status symbol and have it in their landscape garden. And now more recently, succulents.
Again, for prettiness.
For prettiness.
For prettiness. What we do in the name of prettiness.
Yeah, pretty nails and pretty Mercedes-Benz and pretty hairstyle and a pretty cycad in the garden. There we go.
You know you've made it.
Succulent trade. Succulents. I mean, that's just become massive. Absolutely huge.
Definitely, because this is honestly a situation where people do not know. And for the first time, I'll stand by them. They do not know what they are supporting with this massive succulent. It's always been popular and it's always been cute and nice and lovely. But in the last 5 years, the craze over succulents, there are Instagram accounts, there are websites. You go onto Facebook, there's, and I really want to touch on this. On Facebook, we're talking locally here in East London. There's a marketplace Facebook page, and they sell everything left, right, and centre. And there's especially this one woman that keeps driving it, and it's succulents. And you pay 250 Rand, and you get a whole box of succulents. Well, nobody knows what they're, even here in our local nurseries, where are these succulents coming from? And I know they propagate easy, but I don't see any propagation farms going on. I don't see any nurseries specializing in propagating these succulents. They are being bought, like you said, like the cycads are being bought up in Johannesburg. They are coming from somewhere.
No, so there are actually some very big succulent nurseries. And as you say, some of these species do propagate easily.
Nothing comes from Asia. Boxes of succulents you're buying online from and comes from somewhere.
Right, but South Africa, and particularly our drier areas, where we didn't even have succulents as protected species at one stage because no one was worried about these things. Now suddenly there's this market worldwide for succulents, and it's easy to put them in a cardboard box and post them somewhere. And we've got so many different species in South Africa. There's so many endemics that just occur on one little mountain sometimes, and people hear about it and they read it in research papers or books on succulents, and they want those things, and then they'll tap into to getting poor people to go and collect those plants for them and pay them a little bit of money, and then they've got succulents which they can trade with. So we've pretty much lost some of our species already, and there's a scramble to get these things identified and put into legislation and protected. But again, easy enough to eventually put it into legislation and have it declared as endangered or protected. Far more difficult to catch the people that are involved in trading with it. And again, it's easier to catch the people that are going and collecting it in the veld, but it's far more difficult to get the person that's the mastermind behind the trade in it, and than the person who's making all the money out of it. But we've had some big successes, and even one of the very big nurseries out in Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth Way, we charged them recently thousands upon thousands of succulents that they've collected out of the veld. And fortunately that whole operation has been closed.
Fantastic.
But unfortunately, tens of thousands of succulents died because, while one waits for the court case, You've got to look after those plants, and it's just a mess. So there's a huge trade in organised crime is a massive problem. I think how long have we got left, Chris? So that I know what to concentrate on.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
I don't think we should worry too much about the organised crime, because that would be a specialised podcast as well. But it obviously links into the history quite well.
Okay, so
to bring to date, you came to the rhinos, which was a massive movement. A lot of new human beings. We grew up with Save the Whales, grew up with Save the Rhino. Can you give us? Was it 2012? When was the first rhino poached in the Eastern Cape?
So that was in December 2008.
2008.
Yeah, where a rhino was shot with an AK-47 in Shamwari Game Reserve, or Shamwari Nature Reserve, just outside Port Elizabeth, or Quebec as it's now known. One of the premier private game reserves in South Africa, and recognised internationally. That's you would think that people would leave a nature reserve like that, because it's very well managed. It's got an anti-poaching unit. In fact, the anti-poaching unit was only established after that rhino was poached. So let's give them credit over there. But that was the start. The first rhino that was poached in the Eastern Cape, and then it escalated from there. Fortunately, we never got to the stage, and we still haven't got to that stage, touch wood, of provinces like Limpopo and of the Kruger National Park, where several rhino were being killed per day.
Yeah.
But we lost a lot of rhino. The most important syndicate that we managed to crack and bring down was the Ndlovu syndicate, and they were using darts and tranquilizers, drugs to shoot rhino, and when the rhino was tranquilized, they would saw the horn off and leave the rhino there just to bleed to death. That took place over a number of years until that syndicate was tackled through joint operations with our South African police services and conservation departments. And fortunately, they're still sitting in jail, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment, basically. So there have been, over the years, some very good judgments in the rhino poaching field. When initially it was just a small fine, it's now got to a stage, if you poach a rhino, you are going to go to jail.
I'm purposely not saying too much, because I think we're going to go out for another 45 minutes if I start injecting questions and comments into this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe let's just touch on the implications of rhino poaching. So, yeah, it's very positive that it's pretty much stabilized now. It's gone, the amount of rhinos poached has gone down from well over 1,000 a year to around about 400, 500 a year. But the amount of money that's been put into rhino conservation,
amount of money,
billions. And I mean, it's been from non-profit organizations, non-NGOs. It's been from philanthropists from overseas, and the money's been pumped into rhino conservation at the expense of conservation of a whole lot of other species, and that's what you've got to realize. So, while the rhinos benefited, something like, let's just use the pangolin. Yeah, pangolin is a huge trade at the moment. It's escalating. We spoke of succulents. The money's not coming in there to look after succulents.
And also recently speaking to some, I don't know if I can mention the name, but I think it was clivias that were being removed illegally, mass amounts of clivias.
Yeah.
But then they also realized what was being sold online from this region were our insects. And if you go onto Amazon, you can honestly, I remember COVID just started, a wonderful nonprofit shut this down very quickly. I think she was in America. They were selling shark embryos in bottles on Amazon. You could buy a shark embryo. It's if you go, pretend you're someone else and go online, whether it's Amazon or Facebook, wherever you are in the world, you will be able to buy anything. Yeah. You don't know where it comes from. You don't know how it was put into its little bottle. Why is it in a little bottle? But the most exotic creatures, plants, insects.
Yeah, well, I just think of the case that we had about spiders. So there's also a demand for spiders.
Yeah.
And I remember my investigator at the time not being very keen to do this investigation because he had this fear of spiders, but big trade in spiders. They were going to Germany. So it's just about anything.
Stop killing spiders.
Anything is now
Make a
tradable.
little conservation protected area in your garden. No one kills an insect. No, but really, it is. We do not understand how much is being harvested of our natural resources.
Yeah. So as we wind down, Chris, I think again, and you always ask me to leave some sort of a message. I think the message I'd like to leave is the importance of non-government and non-profit organizations in the conservation sector now in South Africa. I think that that's going to be the future. I see government obviously continuing to be the regulator and having an important role to stamp things and to do permits and what have you. But the big drive for anything in conservation, creating awareness, creating, pamphlets and documentaries and podcasts and even doing some of the law enforcement is all coming down to the private sector and the non-profit organizations. Obviously hand in hand with government, but I just, people want to know what they can do. I like to emphasize that they should become involved and not just sit back and rely on government.
Absolutely, people, but what can I get involved? Get involved. It's not always money that non-profits need. It's really, I met a friend and she volunteers for non-profits via social media. She manages their social media for free for a 2-month period. There are so many ways that you can be a part of something great and be a part of the better side, the other side of this. And I definitely agree with you. And I want to touch on that. For me, I think at the end of every day is people are not aware of which questions to ask. And that, I think that is where we all have to start, is with questions. And knowing that what that answer means that they are being provided. I always go on about this biodegradable thing. Guys, please go and do some research. That's also another podcast that we'll touch on. Please understand what biodegradable means. Because when you pull that through the ladder, you will understand that South Africa isn't really... I think in America, there are only 2 plants that can recycle biodegradable. In the entire America. I'll go back to the stats because those stats are about 4 years old. But in South Africa, do we even have one? Now take that biodegradable coffee cup of yours, go bury it in your garden, and 2 years from now, go dig it up and take a photo of both because there's no change. And that is, we don't know what to ask, and we are being washed with information. What do people really understand what recycling means? And recycling should be your last option. Start buying the holders, if you can afford to, the holders or the containers that you can reuse. But these are the little things we're being lied about every single day. And we don't know. People don't know. This new biodegradable, people are so chuffed with this biodegradable thing. Yeah. But no one's ever gone and buried the actual. Yeah. We did it.
I did it as well with a beer cup that I got at a beer fest.
And that was biodegradable.
Yeah, it's still there, like 5 or 6 years down the line.
Didn't drink out of it enough. Maybe it biodegrades with
put it in the compost. It's still there perfectly.
Maybe it was supposed to turn into beer. I don't know. But I did it. We did it with a coffee cup in the Philippines, and we buried it. And before I left, we dug that one up. But you could wash it and use it again.
Yeah, so I just also want to emphasize that people must do a bit of research into the non-profit or the non-government organization that they're putting their money to. Because
on purpose we didn't touch on that because we can't. I really want to touch on that. Mm-hmm. I've heard heartbreaking stories of people pouring a debit order into a non-profit, and all the noises there. The fantastic. Stop trusting the social media.
Yeah.
Stop it. I just yesterday saw another post from a non-profit. This was the reef in 2012. This is the reef in 2020. It's not the same reef.
Sure.
It's not, and people don't understand. And I was sitting with a friend, and she goes, "Oh, look how healthy that! It's a feather star. It's not even a coral that you're looking at." The start asking the right questions, but somebody was donating a lot of money to a orangutan sanctuary. A lot of these sanctuaries are in Asia because that's where the animals are. And letters were being written. It's all a bit of an emotional play, and it should be. But how the orangutan was doing, and photos of the orangutan. When she finally suddenly realized the orangutan starts looking different. So she goes and visits the sanctuary. She doesn't even know because the orangutan's got a name. Let's say Benny. It wasn't Benny. There was no Benny there. Where did this photo of her orangutan that she chose to sponsor, where was the orangutan? The sanctuary was a fright. Nothing at all that she was seeing on the social media. And this is really what I want to focus on in 2024, is to start, because I've been doing this for a long time now, from the side that we are speaking to, as a volunteer, as somebody who cares, as somebody that wanted to put a debit order into something. I'm not saying kick all non-profits out, but we have to start being educated on what we are being told. We're saving the reef. Okay, how? By building coral nurseries. Okay, how? But now if you don't know coral, how do you know that coral nursery is even ethical? And the questions go on and on and on. And then people start donating to long-standing non-profits because that is the safest. You've got some beautiful. Amnesty International, I personally have been getting them a debit order since when I went to London, which was 2005, 2006. They still get their money from my bank account on a monthly occasion. But then the smaller non-profits suffer because the money's still going to the big guns. Yeah. But unfortunately,
if you don't know, rather do it that way.
Rather do it that way. Yeah. Or my advice is watch a non-profit. You can like them, that those algorithms also build up their listenership. All of that could also help them. But before you donate money, and you can't go and visit the non-profit, just watch them for 2 years. Just watch what they're doing for a 2-year period and then start asking questions. And if it's a legit non-profit, there is certain transparency paperwork that they can send you and should be sending you.
Yeah, I just want to mention how the non-profits jumped up like mushrooms. They just flip in a rows when the rhinos.
You told me about that. I want to put it on a headline. Please, let's end with that.
We can do a rhino podcast. I'm sure we will at one stage, and I'll raise it there again. But as soon as the rhinos started falling, suddenly these non-profits, saving the rhino non-profits, jumped up, and within the space of a few months, there were over 400 of these non-profits that had jumped up, selling rulers in supermarkets and doing trail runs and all for the rhino. And I know of kids that saved up their pocket money, took all their birthday money and gave it to non-profits that basically didn't exist, or they existed just in name, and they had a bank account, and all the money that they were gathering just went into the pocket of whoever established that non-profit. It was horrible. Because, in the Eastern Cape, out of 400 and something non-profits that we knew about, only 2 were providing us with any money for our campaign of investigating rhino poaching syndicates and so forth. In the Eastern Cape, just 2 provided us with any funding and assistance.
Start asking questions. Start listeners. That's what we're ending with. Start asking questions.
No, great. Well, it's been interesting. I think we've touched on a number of the important milestones of conservation over the years. We obviously haven't touched everything, but that gives a good background, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Div. Stay tuned for our next episode next week. Thank you.